Alright, so I now officially have the Ally in hand and have been putting it through its paces for the past few days, and I have to say, this thing is thoroughly good, if not totally great. However, it's not perfect, but to be fair, I mean, what piece of hardware actually is? So that's what I wanted to talk about today, is actually what my first experience with the ROG Ally has been like, specifically going through the setup, what you can expect from the hardware and software that's on offer from Asus, and then finally, of course, what it's like to, actually play games on the thing. But for now, let's go ahead and start with the unboxing and setup part of the ROG Ally. In the box, you'll find the unit itself staring you in the face as soon as you pop the lid, and on top of the box lid you get this comically flimsy little stand that does just about the bare minimum to keep your device upright. I mean, don't get me wrong, it is functional, but it also just feels like the most bare bones attempt at including a stand, which I don't love it, but for the purposes of filming this video, it was, functional enough for me to get the job done. Beyond that, you have the charger, and then all of the paperwork with your warranty, initial setup information, that kind of thing, and that is all that is in the box. Now, the unit itself is wrapped in plastic that makes your first steps really straightforward. Plug in the power, turn the thing on. Which, hilariously, I completely neglected to do initially, and I thought to myself, hey, I don't need to plug in the power adapter, I'm just going to power this thing on, see how much battery it has. But if you try to do that, the thing will not turn on, as I found out very quickly, so yeah, just follow the instructions. So after I got the adapter connected and powered everything up, the setup got rolling pretty quickly, but I hit more than a few weird little issues and snags in just trying to get the Ally set up for the first time. No real showstoppers per se, just a bunch of weird little things that kind of drag down the experience of tearing into a new gaming handheld. For instance, even though the tutorial videos that you can access from the QR code on the device say that you can just tap into a field and have an on-screen keyboard appear, it absolutely would not appear for me when I was trying to get logged into my Wi-Fi, so I had to reboot the device a couple of times, and then for reasons unknown to me, it finally started working. And as I got deeper into the Windows 11 setup experiences, one of the things that you're prompted to do is go ahead and use the fingerprint reader that's built into the power button so you can set up authentication for the device. So I went ahead and did that, and it was, similar to any other time that I registered my fingerprint with a device, and it went pretty quickly. But then for some reason it just decided to stop using that altogether. And after a reboot, it prompted me to start using the PIN instead, which was fine, but then after I tried to use the PIN, it said the PIN wouldn't work and made me log into my Windows account and basically do the whole process again, which was really odd. Now, to be fair, on subsequent reboots my PIN continued to work just fine, but it was a little concerning to me that right out of the box the primary authentication method on the device just decided not to work. Now, I suspect this is an issue with Windows 11 and not a reflection of Asus or their hardware, but it is just one of those things that I'll have to dig into more deeply, and again, just kind of a weird roadblock to encounter when you're setting up a device for the first time. Also, right as I was wrapping up the Windows 11 setup portion, I did encounter a few error messages telling me that Armory Crate had crashed, which, if you're not familiar, Armory Crate is one of the primary pieces of software that kind of bridges that gap between Windows hardware and, the software that you're using to play games. Thankfully, that didn't seem to be a big deal, because after a reboot, I did not encounter it again, and Armory Crate fired up just fine whenever I had the device fully running, but still, again, all of these things kind of coalesce together to make it maybe not the most comforting setup experience that I've had for a new consumer device, so just be warned that, if you do decide to get an Ally, the setup process may or may not be smooth, and you will definitely have some firmware updates and reboots to do. Which, to be fair, the Steam Deck also had firmware updates to do right out of the box, but it did not have quite as many, sort of scary error messages or kind of like, weird little peccadillos that you had to deal with to get the thing rolling. But after I made it through those initial setup quirks, I wasted no time immediately installing Battle.net, Steam, and also Xbox on the device to make sure that I could just start loading up a ton of games on this thing to test out. Now, I will say that Battle.net and Steam had almost no problem loading at all, although it is kind of weird and feels dirty putting like Steam Big Picture mode on this device, considering I'm so used to seeing it on the Steam Deck. But weirdly, Xbox had the most problems, and I believe that was because as soon as I tried to fire up the Xbox app to start downloading things from Game Pass, it did throw up kind of a warning bar at the bottom saying, hey, there's like a Microsoft game service that has to be installed before we can continue, and after that was done and on a reboot, then they started to work just fine. But it's kind of weird that I had such a smooth setup experience with Battle.net and Steam, but then for some reason Xbox, which was like, probably one of the biggest draws for me to even consider this system, really kind of had some trouble right out of the gate. But again, not a showstopper, just kind of annoying, and after a reboot and after it installed that service, it seemed to work fine. Now let's go ahead and go back to Armory Crate and Command Center for a second so we can kind of go over Asus's software that's here that, again, kind of bridges that gap between Windows 11 and the hardware that you're using to actually play the games. Command Center is accessed by pressing the lower button to the left of the screen, and it functions as a quick menu like what you get on the Steam Deck, although that normally slides in from the right side of its interface. Here you can control the power draw profile the Ally uses to fine-tune performance, adjust your control mode in use, or lock the frame rate down to 15, 30, 45, or 60 at the system level. It's quick and responsive to get to, and the shortcuts within Command Center can actually be customized within Armory Crate, which was kind of weird to me. I kind of figured there would be like a settings option right, directly within Command Center, but I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense considering Command Center is kind of a list of shortcuts to get to common system functions, so I guess it does kind of make sense that you customize those somewhere else. It's kind of just a repository of shortcuts, I guess, for, quick access to functionality. Which brings us to the interface where you can configure Command Center, and that is Armory Crate. Now, Armory Crate serves a few different functions, but primarily what it does is it just consolidates all of the games that you've installed from other marketplaces. So if you install a bunch of games from Xbox, Steam, GOG, Epic, or wherever, it will keep them all nice and tidy for you in this specific interface so you can launch them easily, regardless of the platform that they're on. And it's pretty standard stuff here. You can sort them alphabetically, by recently played, by recently added, or you can group them by platform, which is what I chose to do because it just seemed like an easier way to kind of keep track of the games that I was playing on one platform versus another, specifically because there's some overlap there, right? There are some games that I have available to me on Game Pass, but then I also have a native copy of them available on Steam, and sometimes it's hard to remember exactly where I made the most progress, considering those save files will be treated differently. So yeah, personally, I decided to just group these by platform within Armory Crate. Now, aside from the games portion of Armory Crate, there's a secondary tab which provides you access to all of your settings for deeper system functions and fine-tuning things even further. This is where you can get a little bit more granular if you want to completely fine-tune everything right down to your fan curves. There are also a number of visual modes that you can enable here to kind of change the way your games look, because depending on whether you're playing an FPS or a racing game, or maybe you're playing some indie game where you just want the colors to be hyper-saturated, you can make all those adjustments here as well. This is also where you can configure the RGB lighting for the analog sticks, but personally I really like just the regular rainbow effect that was there by default, so I decided to leave it, but it is cool that they give you the option to fine-tune it, although I do wish you could get a little bit more detail with that, but honestly this is the only system I think I've ever had that had RGB lighting built into the front of it, so I'm just going to count my blessings and, I'm fine with it. And that seems like a pretty good place to segue to the hardware itself, because as soon as you boot this thing up, it becomes immediately clear that this is a crisper, cleaner experience than what you get at first boot on the deck. And even though it's not an OLED or anything, colors on the display just seem more vivid to me for some reason. Maybe it's because they made it more saturated out of the box, I'm not sure, I'll have to check that, but it's definitely a good experience as soon as you look at it. And also I should point out that the touch responsiveness is just top notch on this display. I don't think I had a single mistap the entire time I've been navigating it yet, which is pretty impressive considering a lot of the on-screen elements, particularly those in Windows, are a lot smaller than whenever you see like, custom buttons for an application interface that are kind of designed for touchscreen. But I gotta say, the thing that I was most excited to check out, aside from just, what that display was gonna look like, was how actually comfortable was this device. And I have to say, it's pretty cozy. And after spending a few hours on my couch holding it up, playing like this with it just kind of like right next to my face and keeping it sort of parallel with my head, I have to say I really didn't get any like wrist fatigue or any tiredness or anything like that, and it really is impressive, how much lighter the system is, and it really does feel a little bit more comfortable to hold for long stretches of play, at least in my experience. And I have to say, despite my skepticism about the lower corners of the device, those angled corners actually feel pretty comfortable and they contour to your palms really well. Now, as for the buttons, the face buttons feel pretty good in a not too mushy, not too clicky sort of way, and despite early reports of the X button sticking, I absolutely hammered that thing for like 5 minutes straight to see if I could get it to stick, and I absolutely could not. I'm not saying that there isn't a single unit out there that has the sticking X problem, I'm just saying that I was not one of them, and maybe this was something that they modified before like those launch units actually started rolling out. I don't know, all I can say is that at least so far, I have not encountered it. The analog sticks feel butter smooth, though they're definitely a little bit smaller than the deck, so you may appreciate that if you have smaller hands. Or on the flip side, you may not be a fan of this and actually prefer the larger analog sticks, and I think maybe slightly longer throw distance of what you would get from the Steam Deck. But honestly, they're not too small, they're not too big, they're kind of just Goldilocks right in the middle, right? It feels like somewhere between the Steam Deck and the Nintendo Switch in terms of how big those analog sticks are. Personally, I think they perform really well, and I didn't take any issue with them, and honestly, it was kind of nice going back to the staggered analog stick since I always preferred that configuration of my controllers anyways. The D-pad feels good, but I really haven't had a chance to test it in any significant way for like ultra precision for, like old school platformers or fighting games or something like that. I can say it feels good under thumb, and at least, in the limited time that I've used it so far, it's been responsive, but yeah, I can't really speak to it beyond that. The shoulders and triggers feel responsive, and I really like the texture on those buttons as well. I'm not sure how I feel about the more pronounced flare on the triggers, but they seem to have a similar amount of travel to the deck with a slightly smaller footprint. Although one thing I'm not quite sure that I like are the two rear paddles, M1 and M2, which serve as macro buttons that you can kind of remap for whatever functionality you need. And they don't feel bad or anything necessarily, they just feel kind of weird. They don't really feel like a trigger, they don't really feel like a button, they almost feel like pebbles on the rear of the device. So it's kind of weird reaching back there and like you can feel the click, but it also just sort of feels like you're using like a jelly bean or something as a control back there. Maybe that's a weird take. All I'm saying is it feels like this weird pebble-like bulge on the back of the system, which, again, it's perfectly functional and it's not uncomfortable, just kind of weird. So all in all, I'd say the hardware feels pretty top-notch, although I don't love the aggressive Republic of Gamers branding on the rear of the device, but that's just a matter of personal preference, right? You may be a huge fan of the Republic of Gamers branding. I just personally don't think it's that great and would prefer something a little more muted and subdued in line with the Steam Deck, but that's nothing like a new case couldn't solve or something like that, so completely minor gripe. But putting aside the setup, the hardware, and the software, how is actually, playing games on this thing? In a word, fantastic. In 15 words, yeah, it's fantastic after you jump through a few Windows-related hoops here and there. Now, the first thing I did was let it play at 25-watt turbo mode unplugged while I played Chorus on my couch, which is just a wonderful game and I highly recommend it as just like this bombastic space shooter with a ton of story and lore to chew through, but I digress. Playing at the default settings, which for Chorus is Ultra at 60 FPS and 720p, I was able to play for about an hour and 3 minutes before hitting a low battery warning, which I think with previous sessions on the deck I would have been able to squeeze out 2 to 3 hours of play with this particular title. But again, that's kind of to be expected from a device that's billing itself as 50 to 100% more powerful than the Steam Deck. If you're going to have that kind of graphics, it's going to draw a lot more power, so not entirely unexpected I guess, but just something to keep in mind. And let me tell you, you will absolutely notice the difference in almost any game that you fire up. Now, I didn't do a marathon session running through like 30 or 40 different games or anything like that because, again, this is kind of a first impressions video, but I did fire up some beefier titles, like I fired up Hogwarts Legacy for a little bit, Cyberpunk, and Diablo 4, and it is a clear upgrade out of the box with, no additional configuration done. Now, I'm sure I could have gotten even better performance if I'd taken the time to tweak some of the graphical settings, and later on I did attempt some of that, but not enough that I could really say anything conclusive in this video. For now, just know that if you have played certain games on the Steam Deck before and then you fire up those same games on the Ally, there's a very good chance that you're going to have a noticeable visual upgrade. Beyond those initial heavy hitters, I did try to hop around a range of different games just to kind of get a feel of what I could expect from different scenarios. Hot Wheels Unleashed looked tasty good on this screen, and it was pretty crazy seeing that even at ultra quality settings, you could easily get a consistent 90 to 100 FPS, and if you drop the resolution to 720 with FSR set to balanced, I was getting very near, if not directly, 120 FPS. Which just seemed crazy to me in a handheld. Now, I know this isn't the most taxing game from a visual standpoint or anything like that with a ton of like weather effects or physics or anything like that, but it was still pretty cool seeing an arcade racer of this caliber just set to its maximum arcadiness and just performing at, a blistering speed in a handheld. I also spent some time returning to my personal game of the year for 2022, Elden Ring, and while it's not running at a solid 60 frames here, it sure does pop on the Ally's screen, and if you play tethered to the power supply where it can turbo boost to 30 watts instead of 25 watts, you'll see a noticeable bump up in frame rate. Honestly, I'm still working my way through a variety of games, and I'm sure I'll have some upcoming videos that go through what some of those experiences are like on the Ally, but for now, just at a baseline, it is definitely better than the deck in terms of what you initially see on the screen, usually at default settings for every game that I fired up at least. So yeah, to kind of wrap this whole thing up, because again, this is kind of an impressions piece, and I haven't done any like long-form testing. I've had like a year to mess around with the Steam Deck and try like, just dozens and dozens of games on that system. The Ally I've had for about 3 days at this point. I've, not been able to do nearly as much testing with it, but I will say my initial impressions are very positive. Now, does it solve every single problem that, would have arisen from a console-like device that is actually a PC? No, it doesn't. And in some ways, I would say some of those are kind of exacerbated even, because Windows 11 can be really squirrely, really quirky, really temperamental when it comes to running games and software with just like tons of pop-ups and notifications. But at the end of the day, when you can get through all of those Windows-related or software-related hoops and just get the game going, it runs fantastically well. And if you ask me right now, like, hey, you have to play some new game that you're really into, either on the Ally or the deck for an hour, I would be very tempted to choose the Ally, because at this point I will say that in terms of like the raw video game experience, it does seem to be better on the Ally. Now, again, that's coming at the expense of power, obviously, so you're not going to expect to have like, this amazing frame rate and top tier graphics and then have like a 6-hour battery life or something. But nonetheless, if you are somebody who plays in shorter chunks or shorter sessions, as I often do since I'm like a second screen gamer who likes to like watch stuff on the TV while I play a game in handheld mode, it looks really, really promising. Again, lots more testing to do with this device. Like, there are so many things that I haven't tried yet, like, even more alternate storefronts. I haven't messed around with emulation or anything like that. I haven't really tried dock mode that much with it to see what that experience is like, but yeah, initial impressions are very positive. Again, not a perfect system, but pretty awesome for a first effort out of the gate. I still have a lot of concerns about things like ongoing support and how well Asus will stand behind this product, because Valve's done a great job with the Steam Deck, but we'll see what happens. But hey, what about you? How do you feel about the Ally? Is it a system that you got yourself? Is it one that you're on the fence about picking up? And if so, what are your pros and cons, or kind of what's in your head or your rationale for either going for the system or just passing on it entirely and waiting for maybe the second Steam Deck? Please let me know in the comments below, because I would love to hear your feedback on this. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch these videos. It means a lot to me. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.